time I pull my coins out, I think, now this one is the most special. This one has the most history. But when I clutch this coin here, this 1761 Mexico City Mint Spanish pillar dollar, this 8 reals, I cannot help but realize it is perhaps one of the, if not the most historical coin that I own. This is the only pillar dollar of this time period, those struck between 1732 and 1772, that I own. The date, very historical. We're going to get into that later in this video. Now, there is too much history regarding this particular coin, any pillar dollar, and the date range, the imagery that is struck onto them. There's just too much history to get into in a single video. These coins demand almost a mini-series, a multi-part mini-series with hour-long episodes. That is how deep the history is surrounding every single pillar dollar you will see and every little detail. This truly is one of the most spectacular pieces that I own. The Mexico City Mint, where this coin was struck, there's the mint mark there, the M with the little O over the top of it. The oldest mint, the first mint in the New World, founded in 1535. Consider that for a moment, 1535. These get the term milled dollars or milled pillar dollars because milled was a process for striking these coins. It was different from the old hammer cob style that a lot of the New World and the crude struck silver lumps you would see, whose weight and design was just a little bit off and not as reliable when it came to the amount of silver that might be in them. These were more easily recognized, harder to counterfeit, and of course the edge had a security feature of the floral pattern, which was more difficult to, if you wanted to cut pieces of silver or shave the edge off to reduce its weight. Now, I may repeat myself throughout this video because I've often spoken of many of the features that you see on this coin as part of lessons in discussing the history and the origins of the US dollar and silver as money in North America and abroad throughout the world. This really was at one time a one world currency, and I've reiterated that time and time again. I don't think any single coin or series of coins struck by any government has ever seen more travel, more commerce, and been exchanged for more goods and services in the fact that it was sound money than these, than the 8 reals, the pillar dollars. I mean, they're just remarkable. Now, this coin, it has a beautiful strike. It's very clean. All of the details are really still there. And if you look at the pillar and how the ribbons scroll and wrap around, you can easily see the original origins of what we call the dollar sign, the dollar symbol, the S with the bars through it. The pillars are the pillars of Hercules, and they read plus ultra. They used to use V's for U's back then, and that stands for further beyond, or more beyond, meaning more beyond the pillars of Hercules of the sea. You can see the imperial crown, which rests on top of the world's old and new, which sits on top of the sea. The MO, that's again the mint mark from Mexico. And the legend reads, one on both. And I can't pronounce it. I think it's utraque unum, which means one of both. And then the reverse legends read, Charles III. The initials that you see, MM, are the initials of the assayer at the time this coin was minted. The shield, a tribute to the Spanish Granada. Also in the legends are the letters DG, which stands for Die Gratia, or by the grace of God. These Spanish milled dollars were the very first US dollars that were legal tender in the United States, all the way up until 1857, until the Coinage Act of 1857, which reminds me I need to do a video on that for all of you. Now, these coins were actually cut into 8 pieces for change. This was where the saying 2 bits originated, worth 25 cents. 2 bits would be 2 little 8th pieces cut out of this pieces of 8. These coins were used for daily commerce long before the American Revolution was won against the British. Now, to understand what this coin was doing in the New World and why there were these large silver coins, sometimes referred to even as crowns. A large crown would be like the silver pieces you see, 4 of them making up a British sovereign. circulating in England during the same time period. Now, those were a little bit larger. They didn't make their way to the colonies as much and as commonly as these did. But after the introduction of the Guldengroschen in Austria in 1486, the concept of large silver coins with high purity eventually spread throughout the rest of Europe, and it became commonplace to have these larger silver coins. The Wachamsthalers, the Thalers, the Dalders, the Dollars, and then these, the pillar dollars, or the Spanish milled dollar. Now, monetary reform in Spain brought about the introduction of an 8 real or a 1 peso coin in 1497, and it was minted to the following standards. In 1497, it was 8 3/8 dollars to a Castilian mark of silver. I believe that was about 230.0465 grains, or 134 out of 144 parts, making it 0.9306 fine, 93% fine, weighing 25.563 grams of fine silver in the coin. Now in 1728, it was 850 to a mark, or 11/12 parts, and that would be 916 fine, 9167 fine, or 24.809 grams of fine silver. And in 1772, 850 to a mark, a 130 over 144 parts, and that is about 90%, 0.9028 fine, 24.443 grams of fine silver. But the true fineness from the 1772 to the 1821 era, those are believed to be more roughly around the 0.89 in fineness. Now, one of the fascinating things about Spanish silver to me is the origins of the silver itself and the stories, the horrors oftentimes, and the working conditions, the amount of human labor and effort that went into getting the silver itself. Now, there were vast silver deposits found, mainly in Potosi, in modern-day Bolivia, and to a lesser extent in Mexico, for example, the Taxco and the Zacatecas, and to the silver from Spain's possessions throughout the Americas. Mints in Mexico and Peru also began to strike the coin. Now, let's talk about this particular 8 reals, the year itself, and this very coin. It weighs 26.93 grams. Now, each pillar on this particular 8 reals has a different crown. One is the imperial crown, and one represents a royal crown. In a moment, we're going to discuss the time period and the significance of this date. But I want you to look at the imagery on this coin again and really take it in. These were, at the time, remarkable. Think of the world. It was unknown. It was an unknown place left unexplored still. And the two globes, the old world and the new world, on the sea, with the pillars of Hercules representing that gateway to the ocean and beyond, to the new world. These are the pillars of Hercules on the rock of Gibraltar. It's essentially the gateway from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic, to the new world. Now, what is this sound money with the date 1761, this silver coin? Why did I keep referring to it as having some historical significance? The American Revolution begins around this time. As a matter of fact, 1761 to 1774 is really when the tensions built. This is the discussion about the first decade and a half of the Revolutionary era, the period when, according to John Adams, the real revolution occurred. As he later described it, the war was not the revolution, but merely the result of it. Here we will look at why that is true. In 1763, the British Empire stretched around the world from North America to India and points in between. And like I told you, this was the money of the colonies predominantly. The casual, haphazard system of colonial governance would no longer be sufficient. The mighty empire required administration and leadership far beyond that to which the colonies had become accustomed. Furthermore, the long series of wars had left the British deeply in debt, and Britain's far-flung possessions would be costly to manage. All the same, Great Britain was a wealthy nation, though a great portion of that wealth lay in private hands. where would they find the resources necessary to retire that debt? Now, what does that sound like to you a little bit? British officers who had served in America during the French and Indian War returned home to report a prosperous colonial enterprise whose cities of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, although perhaps not up to the standards of London or Paris, nevertheless contained a population of approximately 1.5 million people, most of whom were prospering. America was now too large to be ignored and wealthy enough to be exploited. In order to do that, they had to tighten the rules. Now, what does that sound like a little bit today? Tightening the rules, needing to get a little bit of money for the elite, the royals, the crowns, those higher up. Now, this is where the revolution begins. The influence of the Enlightenment had touched America, and radically new ideas of government, including that of republicanism, had reached across the Atlantic. Because of such things as the Puritan emphasis on reading and the general prosperity of the average citizen, Americans were quite familiar with the new ideas being propounded by the likes of Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu and other philosophers of the French salons, and were well versed in political philosophy from reading John Locke. American ideology also emphasized the idea of virtue as a necessary component of political structure, an idea from the Enlightenment. Of all the shortcomings of British management of their American cousins, their failure to perceive the political sophistication of the colonists was a crucial flaw. A second major misunderstanding lay in the British perception that although they had neglected to enforce various import and export restrictions for decades, the colonists would understand their responsibilities as parts of the empire and readily conform to new and stricter controls. By 1760, smuggling had become a major American enterprise. Given that it was expensive to maintain revenue cutters and other patrol vessels along a thinly populated American coast filled with many bays, inlets, and rivers in which vessels could hide themselves, the British had found it far from cost-effective to try to enforce navigation laws. In 1761, the year of this 8 reals, this pieces of 8, this piece of silver, in this year the British began to reinforce writs of assistance, laws that granted customs officials the authority to conduct random searches of property, to seek out goods on which required duties had not been paid, not only in public establishments, but in private homes. The Royal Proclamation of 1763. You can imagine how upset people got. Imagine the crown just coming into your home to see what you have, to see what you need to pay duties and taxes upon. It's infuriating. Now, this first act in 1761 was just one of many to follow. Next came the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and in 1764, the North American Revenue Sugar Act and the Currency Act. The Currency Act of 1764 prohibited legal tender paper in Virginia, which reduced the circulation of paper money in America, further burdening the colonies, which were always short of hard currency. The British enforcement of the Sugar and Molasses Act quickly cut into the economic welfare of the colonies by causing a slump in the production of rum. Americans were becoming increasingly leery of what they perceived as British attempts to milk more profits from the colonies. Meetings were called to protest the law, and the idea of taxation without representation began to take shape. Next came the Stamp Act crisis of 1765. And here's a quote from John Adams. "It should be your care, therefore, and mine, to elevate the minds of our children and exalt their courage, to accelerate and animate their industry and activity, to excite in them a habitual contempt of meanness, abhorrence of injustice and inhumanity, and an ambition to excel in every capacity, faculty, and virtue. If we suffer their minds to grovel and creep in infancy, they will grovel all their lives. John Adams' dissertation on the Canon and Feudal Law, 1756. Beautiful quote. Now again, the Stamp Act was in 1765. And again, it just continued on from there. His Majesty continuing to try to bleed the colonists through every means possible in taxes and duties. Then came the Declaratory Act of 1766. That's when the Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, in part because their constituents in England quickly perceived that if Parliament could extract revenue from the colonists with a free hand, they could also do so at home. So they were a little scared of that. But as a warning to the colonies, they passed the Declaratory Act of 1766 on the same day. The act stated that Parliament hath and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. Although the Americans had won something of a victory in the repeal of the Stamp Act, they were soon to find that British attempts to raise revenue would not cease. Then came the Townshend Acts of 1767 and 1768. Soon, tensions built. On March 5th, 1770, violence erupted and the Boston Massacre occurred. It began with more or less a rowdy mob taunting a group of soldiers guarding the customs house. The colonists began throwing snowballs, some containing rocks, at the unfortunate soldiers, and threatening the redcoats with clubs. An officer, Captain Preston, appeared and read the Riot Act, yes, an actual document, to those causing this disturbance, ordering them to disperse. Tensions escalated, however, and someone shouted, "Fire!" Weapons were discharged, and 5 Bostonians were killed, including Crispus Attucks, an escaped slave. In the aftermath, it was not clear who had shouted the word that caused these soldiers to discharge their rifles, but in any case, the damage was already done. Now here's a really interesting side fact regarding that story. Captain Preston and the 8 soldiers were tried for murder, and their defender, yes, their defender, was none other than the future American president and revolutionary, John Adams. Adams made a lengthy summary speech addressing the testimony of eyewitnesses, after which he concluded, and I quote, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. If an assault was made to endanger their lives, the law is clear. They had a right to kill in their own defense." Unquote. So Captain Preston and most of the soldiers were acquitted. John Adams' defense of Captain Preston and the soldiers has often been held up as an example of the principle that the rule of law should rise above emotional responses to unpopular events. Yeah, we need more John Adams in our day. Next came the Gaspee affair, and of course then the Boston Tea Party. As you can see, things just began to escalate and get out of hand, all of it dating back to this first year of 1761. Then the Coercive Acts. Now, the Coercive Acts were Parliament's response. It was 5 new laws called the Coercive Acts that soon became known as the Intolerable Acts, which included the following. The Boston Port Bill closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. This is after the Tea Party. A questionable tactic, as commerce in the city would become paralyzed. The Administration of Justice Act, which abolished local administration of justice and provided that the governor of Massachusetts could cause all trials to be conducted in that colony to be removed to Great Britain and heard under a British judge, so that the result would favor the British. The Massachusetts Government Act virtually suspended the right of self-government in the Massachusetts colony by ensuring that the governor and all the public officials would serve at the pleasure of His Majesty. The Quartering Act of 1765 was extended to require that troops be housed not only in public buildings, but in occupied private dwellings, such as homes as well. The Quebec Act extended the boundaries of Quebec and guaranteed religious freedoms to Canadians throughout, though not intended to be punitive, the measure fed into anti-Catholic sentiments. So there was an immediate reaction to this. It would cripple economic life in the city, and hundreds of workers would be affected. Again, all of this getting down to taxes and economics, money, wealth, the crown wanting more, and the colonists not wanting to give up their hard-earned labor to the king, to England. Many of them clutching this very coin. This coin could have been in the pocket, in a drawer, in a shop. Who knows what goods or services it paid for, what debts it extinguished. It's an amazing and remarkable piece of silver. It just goes to show you, silver, wealth preservation over time. It still has purchasing power today. It looks almost the same way it did, likely, as it sat in a drawer sometime during the 1770s or 1780s, all the way up through the 1800s. And again, what's really interesting, although it was struck in 1761, this pillar dollar, which the United States silver dollars were based on, in their weight and in their purity and in their size, this coin could have circulated up until 1857, used as money, as sound money throughout this country. Nearly 100 years. 100 years it circulated as money. Think of that for a moment. 100 years with almost the exact same purchasing power the entire time. You think the US dollar, right now, if you issued one, you think it's going to have the same purchasing power 100 years from now? I doubt it. These did, because they were sound money, because they were silver. Think of that for one moment. Struck in 1761 and used as money all the way up till 1857. And even then, it still retained its wealth and its purchasing power, although it couldn't circulate legally. And we'll get into that coinage act at a later date. I mean, really, although it was, the ones that were struck in 1732, think of that for a moment. 100 years till 1832, they could have served 150 years as money in the United States. And in the silver content side of things, they could have served longer than that. You're talking 200 years of purchasing power or more. It's just remarkable. It's incredible. It really is. And that's one of the most amazing things about silver, about gold, about sound money. The time in which they are able to serve as money. It's essentially almost like immortality for them. Generations have passed. The world's changed quite a bit, and yet here it is. Still sound money. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for bearing with me as we take a look at this historical coin, this beautiful coin. Gosh, it makes me want more of them. Really it is. This is truly my favorite. These are my favorite coins. These are the pillar dollars of this era, 1732, the 1770s, this time frame. These milled pillar dollars with the floral edge. There's nothing like them. There really isn't. These are the most beautiful coin. Just very historical, incredible pieces of silver. Thanks for tuning in, all of you. And we'll do more on these in the future. I appreciate you spending this time here. Thanks for tuning into the Junius Maltby channel. Hit the like, hit the share. Please subscribe and click notifications. See you on the next one.